My name is Frank Delaney, and I am 80 years old. 3 weeks ago, my daughter called me 2 days before the funeral of the man who saved my life in Vietnam and told me, in a tone that carried no real hesitation at all, that she and her husband had already booked a long weekend trip to celebrate their anniversary and that she didn't think missing some funeral for an old family friend was really that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. What she didn't know, and what I myself had no way of knowing until 2 days after that funeral, was that the young man she'd bring home the following week to ask for my blessing to marry was the grandson of the very man whose funeral she'd just skipped for a beach vacation. If you've ever had someone you love dismiss a debt of gratitude they didn't understand the weight of, stay with me until the end. This story isn't about punishing my daughter for choosing a vacation over a funeral. It's about the strange, quiet way the past sometimes circles back to remind us exactly what we owe the people who came before us, whether or not we ever fully understood it in the moment. Welcome to Silent Honor USA, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most. If this story moves you, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly how this connection came to light. I need to tell you about Harold Sutter before I tell you about that phone call, because otherwise a missed funeral and a request for a blessing won't carry the weight they're actually supposed to carry. I enlisted in the Army in 1963, 19 years old, out of a working-class neighborhood outside of Pittsburgh, and I was deployed to Vietnam in early 1966, assigned to an infantry platoon under the command of a lieutenant named Harold Sutter, a man roughly 6 years older than me, who would go on to become, over the course of the following 14 months, the single most significant influence on the rest of my entire life in ways I've never fully been able to explain to anyone who wasn't there beside us. I want to tell you specifically about the day that mattered most, because it matters enormously to understanding everything that happened decades later. In the late summer of 1966, my platoon was caught in an ambush during a routine patrol, pinned down in a position that, by every reasonable calculation our training had prepared us for, should have resulted in considerably heavier casualties than it eventually did. I was hit early in the exchange, a wound to my leg that left me unable to move under my own power, exposed in a position that offered almost no cover, and I remember, with a clarity that has never once faded across nearly 60 years, watching Harold Sutter break from a position of relative safety to come get me, moving across open ground under active fire, taking a wound of his own to his shoulder in the process, and dragging me back to cover through what felt, at the time and still feels now, like an act that defied every reasonable instinct for self-preservation a person could have. I want to describe that specific memory in more detail, because I've replayed it in my mind more times across 60 years than almost any other memory I carry. I remember the sound first, the particular, chaotic noise of the ambush, and then the sharp, disorienting pain of being hit, followed by the specific, sinking recognition that I couldn't move my leg at all, that I was exposed in a position with almost no cover between myself and the source of the gunfire. I remember seeing Harold, from my position on the ground, make eye contact with me for perhaps half a second, a specific look I've never fully been able to describe to anyone, something between calculation and pure decision, before he was moving, low and fast, closing the distance between his own position and mine in a way that seemed, even as I watched it happen, to take both an impossibly long time and almost no time at all. I remember the specific weight of his arm under my shoulders as he pulled me backward, the sound of his own breathing, ragged with exertion and, I would later learn, his own injury, and I remember the particular, disorienting gratitude that flooded through me, even before we'd fully reached cover, a gratitude so large it felt, in that specific moment, almost impossible to contain within my own body. Harold never once, across the following 57 years, made a significant production of what he'd done that afternoon. When I raised it, which I did periodically across the decades, he tended to deflect with a simple, "Any of us would have done the same," a statement I never fully believed, having served alongside enough men to know that not everyone would have made the same decision in those same 4 seconds. I want to be honest about the specific weight of what that moment did to the rest of my life. Harold Sutter didn't simply save my leg or my immediate survival that afternoon. He gave me, essentially, every single year I've lived since 1966. Every birthday, every holiday, my entire marriage, my children, my grandchildren. An entire life that, without his specific decision to run into that exposed position, rather than wait for it to become safer, simply would never have happened at all. I've thought about that mathematics more times than I can count over the following decades. The specific, staggering weight of an entire lifetime existing only because one man made one decision in about 4 seconds of chaos that could have gone an entirely different way. Harold and I remained close for the rest of our lives following that deployment, a friendship that outlasted his own transfer to a different unit later in the war, my eventual return home in 1967, and the following 57 years, through marriages, through the raising of children, through the specific milestones and difficulties that accumulate across an entire lifetime. We spoke on the phone at least monthly for decades, visited each other's families for holidays when distance allowed, and maintained across nearly 6 decades the specific kind of bond that I don't think exists in quite the same way outside of what combat creates between men who've depended on each other for their very survival. I met my wife, Carol, in 1968, shortly after returning home, and we married the following year. Carol understood, from fairly early in our marriage, the specific significance Harold held in my life, and she came to consider him something close to family herself, our 2 households maintaining a warm, ongoing relationship across the following decades that included regular visits, shared holidays, and a friendship between our children that persisted, in a more casual form, into their own adult lives. We had one daughter, Rebecca, born in 1972, and I want to be honest that Rebecca grew up knowing Harold Sutter as a warm, familiar presence in our extended family life. Uncle Harold, as she called him throughout her childhood, without ever fully understanding, I think, the specific weight of what he actually represented to me personally. I told her, at various points across her childhood and into her adult life, in general terms, that Harold and I had served together and that he'd saved my life during the war, but I don't believe I ever conveyed, in the specific, granular detail I've just described to you, exactly what those 4 seconds in 1966 actually meant. Exactly how directly her own existence traced back to a decision Harold Sutter made under fire nearly 6 years before she was even born. I remember specifically a moment from Rebecca's childhood, perhaps when she was around 10 years old, when Harold visited for a summer barbecue, and Rebecca asked him directly what it was like being a soldier. A fairly ordinary question children ask veterans, without much awareness of the specific weight such questions can carry. Harold gave her a brief, gentle answer, something about it being difficult but important work, deflecting the way he always deflected, and I remember sitting there, watching that exchange, and choosing, in that specific moment, not to add anything further, not to tell my own 10-year-old daughter what Harold had actually done for our family, believing, I think, that it wasn't my place to make that moment more dramatic than Harold himself was willing to make it. Looking back now, I recognize that choice, repeated in various forms across her entire childhood, as part of the same pattern that eventually left her without the material to understand the funeral's true significance decades later. I want to be fair to Rebecca here, because it would be easy to paint her simply as callous, and that isn't the complete picture of who she actually is. She's been, across most of her adult life, a genuinely attentive daughter, someone who calls regularly, who has always shown Carol and me real affection and general respect. Rebecca married her husband Daniel in 2016, and I want to be honest that their marriage, while generally solid on its surface for most of those years, has always carried a certain quality of prioritizing their own immediate lifestyle, vacations, social commitments, career advancement, over the kind of extended family obligations that Carol and I, and certainly Harold's own family, had always considered simply non-negotiable parts of a life well lived. I want to note, in fairness, that I didn't know, at the time of that phone call about the funeral, that Rebecca and Daniel's marriage had already been quietly unraveling for several months, a detail that would only come to light during the conversation that followed 2 days after Harold's funeral, a detail that, in retrospect, may have shaped her state of mind during that initial phone call more than I understood at the time. Carol passed 4 years ago, and in the years since, my relationship with Rebecca, while still warm, has carried, I think, a certain drift that I attribute partly to distance. She and Daniel live nearly 3 hours away, and partly to the simple fact that Carol had always been the one who maintained the more frequent, detailed communication between our household and Rebecca's, a role I've never fully replicated on my own since her passing. 3 weeks ago, I received the difficult news that Harold Sutter had passed away, at 86 years old, following a brief illness. News that landed with the particular, specific grief of losing not just a dear friend, but the literal reason my own life had continued for the preceding 59 years. I want to be honest that the days following that news were among the most difficult I've experienced since Carol's own passing, a grief compounded by the specific mathematics I've described to you. The recognition that the man responsible for every day of my life since 1966 was now gone, and that whatever debt I'd carried toward him across 6 decades would now never be fully expressed to him directly again. I called Rebecca the day I received the news, explaining, with as much composure as I could manage, that Harold had passed and that the funeral would be held the following week, in the town outside Cleveland where Harold and his family had lived for most of his adult life, roughly a 4-hour drive from where Rebecca and Daniel lived. I asked, directly, whether she and Daniel might be able to attend, given how significant Harold had been to our family across her entire lifetime, even if she hadn't fully understood, until that phone call, the complete specificity of exactly why. Rebecca's response, I want to be honest, landed with a particular sting that I've thought about many times in the weeks since. "Dad," she said, "I'm so sorry to hear that. I really am. But Daniel and I already booked our anniversary trip for that exact weekend, months ago, and it's completely non-refundable at this point. I don't think missing some funeral for an old family friend is really that big a deal in the grand scheme of things, is it? I mean, I loved Uncle Harold, but it's not like it's immediate family, and we've had this trip planned forever." I sat there, 80 years old, holding the phone, absorbing the particular sting of hearing the man who had given me my entire life since 1966, casually reduced, in my own daughter's words, to some funeral for an old family friend, a characterization that revealed, more clearly than anything else could have, exactly how incompletely I had ever conveyed to Rebecca the actual, specific weight of what Harold Sutter meant to our entire family's existence. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't primarily anger, though a genuine sting was certainly present. What I felt was something quieter and more specific, a recognition that my own decades of discussing Harold only in the vaguest, warmest general terms. Uncle Harold saved my life in the war. A phrase I'd repeated perhaps a dozen times across her entire childhood without ever once sitting her down and explaining the actual, specific 4 seconds that phrase represented, had left Rebecca with genuinely no real material to understand why this particular funeral might deserve to outweigh a non-refundable vacation. I didn't argue with her in that phone call. I simply told her I understood, that I hoped she and Daniel enjoyed their trip, and that I would attend the funeral myself and represent our family there. A response that, in retrospect, I think reflected exactly the same pattern of quiet, non-confrontational acceptance that had allowed this particular gap in understanding to persist across her entire life in the first place. I attended Harold's funeral alone the following week, a difficult but genuinely meaningful day, surrounded by Harold's own family, his wife, Margaret, his 2 adult children, and, I would later learn, his grandson, a young man in his late 20s named Christopher, who I spoke with only briefly during the reception following the service. A polite but fairly unremarkable exchange between 2 people meeting for the first time, under difficult circumstances, neither of us having any particular reason, in that specific moment, to think our paths would cross again in any significant way. I want to describe the specific texture of that funeral because it matters to understanding the particular weight I was carrying when Rebecca's request arrived just 2 days later. I sat toward the front of the small chapel, listening to Harold's children deliver eulogies that touched only briefly, and in fairly general terms, on his military service, focusing instead on his decades as a devoted father, and later grandfather, a beloved figure in his local community, a man who had coached youth baseball for nearly 15 years after retiring from his own career in construction management. I remember feeling, sitting there, a particular loneliness in carrying the fuller weight of what Harold had actually meant to me, a weight that none of his own family, understandably, seemed to fully grasp in the same specific terms I carried it, since Harold himself, true to form, had apparently never made much of that particular story, even to his own children. During the reception, I approached Margaret briefly, offering my condolences, and she thanked me warmly, mentioning that Harold had spoken of me over the years as one of the good ones, a phrase that struck me, in the moment, as considerably smaller than what I felt I actually owed him, though I understood, even as she said it, that Harold himself had likely never conveyed the full specific weight of that Vietnam afternoon to his own wife in any greater detail than he'd conveyed to his own grandson. It was during this same reception that I met Christopher briefly, a polite young man who thanked me for coming and mentioned, in passing, that his grandfather had spoken fondly of his old army buddies over the years, a comment I received warmly but without any particular sense, in that moment, of its eventual significance. What happened next, I want to be absolutely clear, was not something I orchestrated in any way. I had no advance knowledge whatsoever that it was coming, and the specific mechanics of how it unfolded matter considerably to understanding why it carried the weight it eventually did. 2 days after that funeral, Rebecca called me, her voice carrying a particular nervous excitement I hadn't heard from her in some time, asking whether she and Daniel could come visit that weekend, mentioning, somewhat mysteriously, that there was something important she wanted to discuss with me in person. I agreed, genuinely curious but with no particular expectation of what the visit might involve. And the following Saturday, Rebecca arrived not with Daniel, but with a young man I didn't immediately recognize, until he introduced himself and I realized, with a cold, strange jolt of recognition, that I was looking at Christopher Sutter, Harold's grandson, the same young man I'd spoken with briefly at the funeral reception 2 days earlier. "Dad," Rebecca said, once we were all seated in my living room, "I need to tell you something. Christopher and I have actually been together for almost a year now. We kept it quiet because things have been complicated with Daniel. We've actually been separated for the past 8 months and are finalizing our divorce, and I wasn't ready to bring any of this to you until things were more settled. But Christopher and I are serious, Dad, and he wants to ask you something." I want to describe the specific, disorienting quality of that moment, sitting in my own living room, absorbing simultaneously the news of Rebecca's divorce, the revelation of a relationship I'd had no idea existed, and the sudden, vertigo-inducing recognition that the young man sitting across from me was Harold Sutter's own grandson, the same young man whose grandfather's funeral my daughter had dismissed as some funeral for an old family friend, not even 10 days earlier. Christopher, for his part, appeared genuinely nervous, clearing his throat before speaking. "Mr. Delaney," he said, "I'd like to ask for your blessing to marry Rebecca. I know the timing is unusual, with my grandfather's passing so recent, but Rebecca and I have talked about this for months, and I wanted to do this properly, in person, and ask for your blessing before we move forward with anything more formal." I sat there for a long moment, genuinely uncertain how to respond, the specific weight of everything converging in that exact instant. My gratitude toward Harold, my grief over his passing, my hurt over Rebecca's dismissal of his funeral, and now this strange, almost impossible symmetry of being asked to bless a marriage to his own grandson. "Christopher," I said slowly, "do you know who I am? I mean, do you know the specific history between your grandfather and me?" Christopher looked slightly confused. "I know you served together in Vietnam," he said. "My grandfather mentioned you a few times over the years. Actually, he used to talk about a Frank from his unit, but I didn't put together it was you specifically until Rebecca mentioned your name a few months ago, and even then, I wasn't entirely sure it was the same person until we were at the funeral and I saw you there. Your grandfather, I said, my voice catching slightly, saved my life in 1966. He ran into open fire to pull me out of a position I would not have survived on my own. Every single day I've lived since that afternoon, Christopher, every year, my entire marriage to Rebecca's mother, Rebecca's own existence, all of it exists because your grandfather made a specific decision in about 4 seconds that most people would never have made. I owe him, quite literally, my entire life. I watched Rebecca's face shift as I said this, watched something genuinely land in her expression that I don't believe had ever fully landed before, despite the vague version of this story she'd heard across her entire childhood. Dad, she said quietly, I didn't know it was like that. I mean, I knew Uncle Harold saved your life, but I didn't understand. I guess I never really understood what that actually meant in specific terms. And I skipped his funeral for a vacation. Dad, I feel sick thinking about that right now. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. My first instinct was not entirely generous, a part of me recognizing the specific weight of the irony now sitting in my living room, but I thought of Harold himself and the particular grace and generosity that had defined his entire character across the 6 decades I'd known him, and I found something steadier instead. Rebecca, I said, I'm not telling you this to punish you for missing that funeral. What's done is done, and I don't believe carrying that guilt indefinitely does either of us any good. But I do think this moment is asking something important of both of us. You're asking me to bless a marriage to the grandson of the man who gave me my entire life, and I think that request deserves more than a quick, easy yes. I think it deserves both of us actually understanding, fully, what we're connecting our families to. We talked for nearly 3 hours that afternoon, a conversation considerably more honest than anything Rebecca and I had managed in years, certainly since Carol's passing. I told her, in the specific, granular detail I'd never previously shared, exactly what happened during those 4 seconds in 1966, exactly what it had felt like watching Harold break cover under fire, exactly what those decades of friendship that followed had actually meant to me, details I'd always kept in the vague, general register of "he saved my life," without ever fully unpacking what that phrase actually contained. I described, specifically, the weight of Harold's arm as he pulled me back to cover, the sound of his own labored breathing, the particular half-second of eye contact before he moved, details I'd carried privately for nearly 6 decades and had never once spoken aloud to my own daughter. I watched Rebecca's expression shift as I spoke, watched her lean forward slightly, genuinely absorbing details she'd apparently never had access to before, despite having heard the general outline of this story dozens of times across her entire life. Dad, she said, at one point, her voice thick with emotion, why didn't you ever tell me it was like that? Why did I only ever hear the short version? I think, I said, I believed, for most of your life, that the short version was somehow more respectful, less dramatic, more in keeping with how Harold himself always talked about it. I think I was wrong about that, Rebecca. I think the short version left you without any real way to understand why this particular funeral might matter more than a non-refundable vacation. Christopher, for his part, shared his own memories of his grandfather, describing a man who had, throughout Christopher's entire childhood, occasionally mentioned a soldier named Frank, with a specific warmth that Christopher hadn't fully understood the significance of until this exact conversation. Memories of his grandfather attending Christopher's own high school graduation, his college graduation, always present, always generous with his time and attention, a generosity that, I realized as Christopher described it, traced directly back to the same character that had led Harold to run into open fire for a soldier under his command nearly 60 years earlier. My grandfather used to say, Christopher told us, that the most important thing a person could do was show up for the people who needed them, even when it was inconvenient or difficult. I always thought that was just a general life philosophy of his, but sitting here now, hearing what he actually did for you, I think I finally understand where that specific belief actually came from. I do give you my blessing, I told Christopher, toward the end of that long afternoon. Not because of who your grandfather was to me, though that matters enormously, but because I believe, watching you these past few hours, that you carry some of that same character forward. But Rebecca, I want you to understand something too. This blessing comes with an expectation that you actually take the time, going forward, to understand the full weight of the people and the history that make up your own family, rather than the vague, general version you've carried until today. In the 3 weeks since that conversation, something has genuinely shifted in how Rebecca relates to me and to her own understanding of her family's history. She's asked, repeatedly, for more detail about Harold, about Vietnam, about the specific texture of my own service. Curiosity that feels genuinely different from the polite, surface-level acknowledgement she'd maintained across most of her adult life. She and Christopher visited Harold's widow, Margaret, together 2 weeks ago, a visit Rebecca described to me afterward with genuine emotion. Listening to Margaret share her own memories of Harold's character, memories that, Rebecca told me, made her understand, finally, the specific gravity of what she'd dismissed as some funeral for an old family friend. I want to describe one specific detail from that visit with Margaret, because it has stayed with me since Rebecca first told me about it. Margaret apparently showed Rebecca and Christopher a small box of memorabilia Harold had kept for decades, including several photographs from his own military service, and among them, a single photograph Rebecca hadn't previously known existed, a picture of Harold and me together at a reunion in the early 1990s, both of us considerably younger, standing with our arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at whoever was holding the camera. Margaret explained that Harold had kept that specific photograph in his wallet for years afterward, only moving it to the memorabilia box once the edges had grown too worn to carry safely. Rebecca told me she'd sat with that photograph for several minutes, absorbing, in a way she said felt entirely different from hearing the story secondhand, the specific visual evidence of a friendship that had shaped her entire existence. Christopher has also begun visiting me somewhat regularly since that afternoon, asking his own questions about my service, about the specific unit he and Rebecca now both understand, connected our two families decades before either of them was born. He mentioned, during a recent visit, that he'd like to have me tell some of these stories in more detail at their eventual wedding, an idea that genuinely moved me, understanding that whatever remains of Harold's legacy would be honored, in some specific way, at the marriage of his own grandson. Rebecca and Daniel's divorce has since been finalized, a separate matter I've chosen not to dwell on extensively in telling this particular story, beyond noting that Rebecca has described the marriage's ending, in our more recent conversations, as something that had been quietly deteriorating for considerably longer than the specific weekend of Harold's funeral, a detail that has helped me understand her initial response to that phone call, with somewhat more compassion than I felt in the moment itself. I don't tell you this story because I want to punish my daughter for a decision she made without full understanding of its actual weight. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. The specific debts of gratitude we carry across a lifetime, the people whose decisions quietly gave us everything we've since built, deserve considerably more explicit explanation than the vague, general terms many of us default to, believing, perhaps mistakenly, that love and warmth alone convey the full weight of what someone actually did for us. Sometimes the people closest to us can't understand a debt they were never actually shown the specific shape of, and sometimes it takes an almost impossible convergence, a funeral skipped, and a grandson's proposal arriving within the same 10 days, to finally reveal exactly what should have been explained all along. I think, often now, about how differently that phone call might have gone if I'd simply told Rebecca the full story years earlier, sat her down properly at some point across her childhood or adult life, and explained, in the specific detail I finally gave her 3 weeks ago, exactly what those 4 seconds in 1966 had meant. I don't believe carrying that particular regret serves much purpose beyond what I've already learned from it, but I share it here because I suspect many of you listening carry similar debts of gratitude toward people in your own lives, debts your own children or grandchildren may have no real way of understanding unless you take the time, deliberately, to explain them in full. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life whose actual significance you might not have fully explained to the people who needed to understand it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because we have a new story like this one every week.